The nation of Syria cannot hold. Don't take it from us, international analysts writing and recording from thousands of kilometers away. Take it from well over 400 representatives of the Syrian people drawn from the country's many ethnic and religious minorities who made precisely that bitter argument at a major conference in the northeast. From the powerful and well-armed Kurds to the embattled Alawites to the fiercely independent Southern Druze and more, the consensus is clear. It is time for the Syrian state to be reimagined, decentralized, disempowered, and in the long run, set aside. According to Syria's own minority leaders, its rights activists, and its religious and spiritual figureheads, the moment to unify Syria has come and gone. That's not going to happen, and it's time to move on to a system that can actually work. But to ask a nation's government to simply give up its power, that's no small demand, and to decentralize the nation of Syria would be a massive undertaking in the best of times. This is a nation still recovering from the ravages of a brutal dictatorship, still reeling from wave after wave of brutal ethnic violence, and led by former insurgents who have yet to earn the trust of the Syrian people or much of the world. To say that Syria should decentralize is one thing, but to build a roadmap to decentralization, to construct a plan for the nation's future, and to put that plan into action, that's a far greater challenge. So, with Syria's own people demanding a seismic change for their nation, the ultimate question is this: can Syria deliver? Just before we continue with today's episode, this is the book, and it is a beautifully illustrated book all about everything. I will open it on a random page. Choose it randomly, and it's going to have a beautiful illustration, I promise. See, look at that. I can see from the preview monitor. That's a microscope, isn't it? It's telling you how a microscope. I've not even seen this page. Oh, yes. This is a fantastic book. It shows you how everything works. It's kind of like a guide. Do they call it a guide to rebuilding society? Yes, exactly. And it has everything that you'd need to know. Is that a water bear? One of those tardigrades? It's really cool. I would just get lost in this. I do get lost in this. I took it home. Show my kids. And they're like, Dad, what is this? I don't understand. I'm like, yeah, but look at the pretty pictures. But this thing also is hiding something. It's got a genuine quest hidden among 400 pages of knowledge, inventions, clever diagrams, and weirdly hypnotic illustrations. Hidden in the pages are butterflies, actual drawings, and if you follow them, they lead to puzzles. Solve enough of those puzzles and you uncover a secret website, and that's just the first layer. It goes deeper than that. There's a whole quest built in. Only 7 people have solved it, by the way. Just 7. And if you crack it, you get a real reward and membership into something called the Order of Seekers, which is fun. I'm not that big brains. I haven't succeeded. It's part book, part puzzle, part rabbit hole. If that sounds like you're kind of strange, and it's just fantastic. I know they want me to push the quest, but irregardless of the quest, this is just genuinely I don't know, I like coffee table books anyway. I got a few of them. This is the king of coffee table books. Follow the link in the description. Use the code WarFronts10 to grab a copy. Again, that's WarFronts10 at checkout. And just get it. It's fantastic. Back to today's episode. When longtime Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad toppled from his throne after a lightning assault by rebel forces last December, it was obvious to the entire global community that whatever came next for Syria was not going to be easy. According to even the conservative estimates, well over 500,000 people were killed in Syria over 13.5 years of civil war, including multiple hundreds of thousands of civilians who lost their lives and over 10 million internally or internationally displaced. The nation's economy was in shambles, many of its cities lay in ruin, and the leaders of the rebel coalition that took it over had cut their teeth fighting as a part of Al-Qaeda and alongside the Islamic State. But even still, despite all the odds stacked against Syria and its people, there was hope. After all, few fates could have been worse than what Syria had already endured under Assad: mass killings, internal anarchy, and a totalitarian system of internal repression that had disappeared thousands upon thousands of people. Compared to the half-century of agony inflicted upon Syria by Assad and his father, just about anything would qualify as an improvement, and in that sense, Syria's lot has gotten better under the new leadership. International aid and investment have come flooding back in at levels not seen since the start of the civil war. Violence overall is on the decline, while the nation's transitional government has shown a willingness to move towards free and fair elections, with the first set of parliamentary elections set to take place in mid-September. Yet despite cause for some cautious optimism, Syria's transition has come with profound and enduring setbacks for the entire nation. In March, after clashes between government forces and loyalists to the old Assad government, elements of Syria's government forces and allied militias slaughtered well over 1,000 members of the nation's Alawite minority, the very same group that included the Assad family and whose people made up a disproportionate share of government officials and military leaders in the old regime. After the massacres in March, a similar situation played out in July, when in the south of the country, violence between Syria's Druze minority and its Sunni Bedouins was accelerated by the involvement of government and pro-government groups, killing over 1,400. The Syrian government has been unable to come to terms with the autonomous Kurdish-led administration that holds territory in the northeast and have exchanged fire with Kurdish forces as recently as this very month. The Islamic State is on the verge of a comeback, helped along by the instability across the entire nation, while Israel engages in semi-regular airstrikes against the Syrian state. Although portions of each of Syria's minority communities have advocated for continuing dialogue and cooperation with the national government, preferring to stay the course and allow Syria's delicate transition to play out, many among Syria's minority groups have long since made up their minds about an interim government that, at best, was utterly incapable of stopping its own people from perpetrating mass violence. It was in that guarded and justifiably skeptical spirit that Syrian minority leaders gathered together in the conference that we discussed at the top of this episode. The conference brought together more than 400 representatives from various ethnic and religious groups, all gathered together in the northeastern city of Al-Hasakah, a highly diverse community of a bit under 500,000 people nestled safely in the territory of the Kurdish-led autonomous zone. By the meeting's end on Friday, the 8th of August, the hundreds of representatives had agreed to send a message in one voice. Together, they condemned the attacks on Alawite, Druze, and Christian minority groups across Syria by government-affiliated armed groups and described those attacks as being tantamount to crimes against humanity. They called for the drafting of a new constitution for the country, including explicit guarantees to enshrine ethnic, religious, and cultural pluralism, and they called for a fundamental change to the nature of the Syrian government itself. According to the conference and its attendees, Syria should transition into a decentralized state in which self-governing, autonomous groups all across the nation can see to their own affairs while working as active participants to strengthen a larger Syrian confederacy. At the conference, a range of prominent minority figures made their own stances known. The spiritual leader of the Alawites, Ghazal, accused Syria's leaders of ideological extremism and told the world that they intended to impose their view of religion on the Syrian people, killing minorities intentionally in the process. Druze spiritual leader Hikmat al-Hijri, a forceful supporter of the Israeli intervention on the Druze community's behalf, decried the Syrian government's treatment of its own pluralistic population as a threat to state stability. Not far from the conference, a top Kurdish commander within the Syrian Democratic Forces accused the Syrian transitional government of becoming a continuation of the old dictatorship instead of building the democratic state that they had promised. And after the conference concluded, Syrians took to the streets not just to call for peace, but for self-determination, particularly in the southern Druze majority areas that were hit hardest in the July round of ethnic killings. The response of the Syrian government in the aftermath of the conference was a predictable one. Syrian transitional leader Ahmed al-Sharaa and his fellow administrators rejected the call for decentralization out of hand, reiterating the stance that they had expressed since taking power, that Syria must be unified even despite the challenges that come with that mission. Sharaa outright refused the call for discussions on the idea of a partition for any group or for any reason. Sharaa and his government have consistently opposed any talk of decentralization, whether it comes from the Druze, the Kurds, the Alawites, or anybody else. Back in April, several rival Kurdish parties in the autonomous northeast issued a group call for a future constitution to acknowledge Kurdish national rights as a, quote, decentralized democratic state, an idea that Sharaa's office dismissed at the time as, quote, separatist cantons. As Sharaa expressed back then, the unity of Syrian territory and its people is a red line. In more recent discussions with the Kurds in the northeast, Sharaa's government has refused to entertain any discussion of the Kurds or their paramilitaries operating as an acknowledged regional bloc, demanding instead that they integrate fully into Syria's government and military structure. This time, the rhetoric from Sharaa was quite similar. We'll quote him: "I do not see Syria as at risk of division. Some people desire a process of dividing Syria and trying to establish cantons. This matter is impossible." But all across Syria, unrest continues to intensify as Sharaa's pleas for unity fall on deaf ears. In large part, that's because of Sharaa and his government's own actions to consolidate their own power to a worrisome degree. The constitutional declaration that Sharar and his administration adopted in March, officially as an interim measure, centralized Syria's state authority in the presidency, allowing Sharar to unilaterally fill a third of the nation's parliament with his hand-picked members and giving him the right to appoint all members of the Constitutional Court, the only institution to which his own presidency is actually beholden. With that kind of control baked into the system, it's unlikely that Syria's paramilitary elections next month would be able to fill parliament with a majority that would be willing to balance out Sharar's leadership, since that would require non-loyalist parties to claim over 105 of the 140 seats still up for grabs. At the same time, Sharar and his government maintain that they aren't responsible for the violence across the country, but they've been slow to take action against the known radical groups within the Syrian military. Those radical groups were integrated into the state security forces or allied militias because it was somewhat less catastrophically bad than just letting them do as they please while holding on to lots of weapons. But that's nothing more than a band-aid solution, and now, nearly a year and 2 rounds of ethnic violence after Sharar took power, the band-aid is long overdue for a permanent fix. Instead, Damascus has recently received a petition from foreign fighters requesting statehood, with many of those foreign fighters being the same ones who took part in sectarian violence or who've committed any number of heinous acts during the civil war. So as disruptive or as unconventional as it may be, the call from Syria's minorities to decentralize the state haven't come out of nowhere. They're a product of more than just the recent sectarian killings themselves. They're a product of the Damascus government's apparent unwillingness to address the root issues that led to those massacres in the first place. Instead of protecting Syrian minorities effectively from those who would do them harm, Damascus has shown that even in the most generous read of this situation, it simply isn't able to stop the massacres from taking place. And that's to say nothing of the less generous ways that we could read this situation, as we're sure you can probably guess. All the while, Sharar's acts to consolidate his power have come without popular consensus, and if international history is any indication, then those changes would make it far easier for Sharar to extend his mandate unilaterally if he chose to do so. Although Sharar's tenure so far isn't nearly black and white enough to cast him as an Assad-style tyrant, Syria's minorities have legitimate cause for concern about the future of their nation. Given Sharar's apparent unwillingness to make Syria's minority groups a part of its political process, the question of decentralization has come to the fore as a matter of necessity. And just before we continue today, just want to do a real quick plug for our fantastic twice-weekly newsletter, which covers all sorts of events going on around the world, obviously in regards to conflict. It goes out, like I said, twice a week. It's completely free, by the way. There's a link below. Now, it'd be entirely fair at this point in the episode to ask whether the idea of a decentralized Syria is even plausible. After all, there are plenty of multicultural societies across the world that have their internal differences, but for whom the idea of just granting everybody autonomy would be a non-starter. Places like the United States, for example, are home to just about every community you could possibly name, but to convert those communities into autonomous self-administered statelets would just be impossible. In Syria, however, the situation's a bit different because modern Syria isn't just one of the more multicultural nations on Earth, it's also among the places where ethnic, religious, or cultural group membership aligns closely with physical geography. For that reason, with most of the nation's minority groups either living in majority-minority areas or aware of a place in the nation where the people do form a local majority, the idea of an internally decentralized state makes a bit more sense. And to get an idea of what a decentralized Syria could look like, it's worth taking the time to look closely at the nation's many minority groups, because after nearly a decade and a half of war, the foundations for a decentralized state already exist. We'll start in the northeast, where the Kurdish-led autonomous administration of Riyadh has been one of Syria's most powerful internal factions for years. Based in the capital of Inisar near the major city of Raqqa, Riyadh is Kurdish-led, but it's a polyethnic and multicultural place in itself, with sizable Arab and Assyrian populations and significant communities from the Turkmen, Yazidi, and Armenian diasporas, among others. Officially, Riyadh is a secular state, and one that proudly expresses a commitment to democratic governance, gender equality, religious and cultural tolerance, and other values that have made it a favorite of Western democracies. For years, Riyadh has enjoyed the support of the US and Europe, and it's widely regarded as one of, if not the most stable zone in modern Syria before and after the fall of Assad. For an autonomous region, Riyadh is quite heavily armed. Its largest paramilitary, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, boast an estimated 100,000 troops or more, with their well-trained, well-equipped and highly experienced fighters having proved themselves in fighting Syria, Turkey, and the Islamic State at various times. Back in March, the Riyadh government inked a deal with Damascus to join together into a unified government, but that deal has fallen apart, largely with Kurdish and government forces now staring each other down over a tense border zone that could easily revert back to a front line. Riyadh has been fortifying its positions over the last few months, including a large network of tunnels that it could use to fight asymmetrically against Damascus if necessary. Riyadh is skeptical of the role of Turkey, a longtime antagonist of the SDF in Ahmed al-Sharar's new Syria, while it's also trying to maintain its hold on the Islamic State insurgency while pulling back some of its forces for a potentially larger fight against Sharar. Meanwhile, Riyadh has faced its own allegations for years of growing authoritarian tendencies, repression of journalists and independent media, and discrimination against Arab tribal groups, all of which the officials in Riyadh consistently deny. Right now, the Riyadh government is easily the best equipped faction in all of Syria to go off on its own. It's got direct control over oil and agricultural industries. It's got strong support from its paramilitary allies, and it's used to living under constant siege both from Turkey to the north and from the Assad government to the south and west. While backing for the SDF from America isn't nearly so strong under Donald Trump as it tends to be while America's run by Democrats, Riyadh can still leverage robust international connections. That said, it's also the group that the government in Damascus seems to be the most concerned about, knowing that the SDF could go toe-to-toe with government forces in a fair fight, especially after Israel destroyed much of the Syrian military's heavy equipment. Damascus has made clear that if it does engage in military action against the SDF, it'll attack with the support of both the Turkish government and a network of pro-Turkey militias across the Syrian northwest. Damascus has been intent on eliminating that possibility, trying to get the SDF to integrate and become part of the Syrian security forces as individual soldiers, rather than allowing a separate SDF faction within the Syrian military that could one day turn against the state. For Sharar and his government, Riyadh are a powerful potential ally. But where decentralization is concerned, they're a domino that simply cannot be allowed to fall. If Riyadh insists on remaining an autonomous region, then the door is open for Syria's other minority groups to do the same. And although Riyadh is the most powerful region that could preserve its autonomy, it might be Syria's Alawite minority that Damascus would be most concerned about. As we mentioned earlier, Syria's Alawites wielded disproportionate power under the Assad regime, and the Assad family were Alawites themselves. Under Assad, Alawites, on balance, were richer and were more likely to hold important roles in the military or civil society. Although they only make up about 10% of Syria's overall population, they're a local majority in the two Syrian provinces that touch the Mediterranean Sea, Latakia and Tartus. And while many Alawites were more than happy to see the Assad regime fall, many others are still loyal to the Assad family dynasty or the old Syrian regime more broadly. Many are accused or suspected of having been a part of the Assad dynasty's architecture of state repression, and among Syrian communities that suffered mightily under the old regime, Alawites are regarded by some people as Assad loyalists until proven otherwise. It was the Alawites who were targeted in the first wave of mass killings in the post-Assad era back in March, and the circumstances behind those massacres help to illustrate the problem that the Alawites now face. Although pro-government militias, units within the Syrian security forces, and independent roving armed groups massacred over 1,000 Alawite citizens during those attacks, the violence was instigated by Assad loyalists who targeted Sunni Muslim communities, knowing that Sunni armed groups would engage in mass acts of retribution against the Alawites more broadly. Sunni extremists, individuals or groups with an axe to grind against ex-regime officials, and other groups in Syria who carry ba'asas against the Alawites were more than happy to attack at the earliest possible convenience. Difficult as it may be, that reality poses multiple obstacles to the idea of Alawite integration with the new government. It's a difficult proposition for Alawites to try and believe that they should place any trust in the Syrian authorities after what's happened, and at the same time, the existence of real Assad loyalist elements within the Alawite community make it difficult for skeptical Syrians from other communities to overcome their preconceived notions about the group. The Alawite community is relatively well armed, although it has none of the experience of organizing into an autonomous, non-state structure that a group like Syria's Kurds would carry into an era of decentralization. Latakia and Tartus are prosperous, economically vital locations, with Latakia hosting Syria's largest seaport and Tartus hosting Syria's largest refinery. But like the oil fields and the breadbasket under Riyadh's control, these are economic assets that the Syrian administration would be unwilling to give up. Then there's the Syrian Druze minority in the south, predominantly concentrated in the province of Suwaida and otherwise clustered south of Damascus near Jordan and Israel. Like Syria's Kurdish population, the Druze got used to functioning semi-autonomously during the Assad era, working to protect their communities through the use of armed militias that can combine and bring tens of thousands of fighters to bear. Late in the war, the Druze got especially good at staging counter-kidnappings of Syrian regime officials, holding them until the regime agreed to release Druze people and other community members who had been detained by the nation's sprawling intelligence apparatus. They've also gotten their own bitter taste of post-Assad sectarian violence, with Druze militias, Sunni Bedouin armed groups, and government-allied units and militias, all accused of atrocities during the recent flare of violence in July. Uniquely in Syria, the Druze live under the protection of the Israeli government, although Druze attitudes on Israel remain rather mixed in practice. Some Druze leaders, and particularly a cleric named Hikmat al-Hadri, have called openly for Israel to protect Syria's Druze community in solidarity with a large Israeli Druze minority that sends many of its own people to fight in the Israel Defense Forces. Others have advocated against reliance on Israel and have argued in favor of integration with the new Syrian government. Syria's Druze minority lives on defensible territory, especially in Suwaida, but unlike either Alawite or Kurdish areas in Syria, the Druze lack the economic potential to sustain an autonomous state by themselves. Right now, as Syrian government forces keep a perimeter around Druze areas, the community lacks reliable food, electricity, or safe drinking water, let alone the local stability required to rebuild from years of war. And finally, there are Syria's Christians who don't cluster in a particular area in the way that the Druze, the Kurds, or the Alawites have done, but who still make up an important minority in modern Syria. Before the civil war, Christians made up about 10% of the Syrian population, and while their presence was estimated to have shrunk to less than 2% by 2023, the global Syrian Christian diaspora has been eager to return to a more stable, post-Assad version of their home country. Historically, although they didn't form a local majority, they maintained a strong presence in Syrian cities like Aleppo and Homs. Partly because of their more disparate locations across the country, and partly because the community has chosen mostly to flee as refugees instead of taking up arms, Syria's Christians are currently in no position to form a cohesive autonomous region. They have, however, been a target of violence in the last few months, getting wrapped up in the slaughter of Alawites last March and watching as 30 Greek Orthodox adherents died in a suicide attack on a church in Damascus this June, for which extremist, non-government-aligned Islamic factions took credit. Each of these minority groups live alongside Syria's domestic majority, Sunni Muslims of Arab descent, although even among their number, important minority groups still exist. The Assyrian population, for example, lives mostly in the province of Al-Hasakah, where the August 8th Conference of Minorities was held under the control of the Riyadh government. Other Muslim minorities include the Turkmen, Syrians of Turkish origin who reside mostly in the northwest near the Turkish border, and about 3% of the Syrian population who are Shia Muslim, largely a sect known as the Ismailis that are primarily based in Hama and Tartus provinces. Sunni Arabs, Syria's religious and ethnic majority group, make up about 60% of the nation today, once every minority community is accounted for. So, we've spent time laying out such an exhaustive list of Syria's minority communities because if we're going to seriously consider the possibility of a decentralized Syria, we've got to account for each one of those component groups. As we've explained, it's not likely that Syria's current government under Ahmed al-Sharaa would agree to make way for a decentralized Syrian state, or at least not voluntarily. But if the Sharaa government or a successor administration were open to the idea, then it's unlikely that just one or two minority groups would be granted autonomy while it was withheld from all the others. Not only would, say, the Kurds or the Alawites clamor for autonomy if the Druze were to receive it, or vice versa, but in any decentralized confederacy, the Syrian government will want to ensure that communities that support Damascus will have power, influence, and autonomy of their own. Now it's up to the Syrian people to decide whether a decentralized government is right for them. Hopefully, Syrians will get the chance to answer that question for themselves at some point in the near future, and no matter what Syrians would hypothetically decide, we'd contend that the nation will be better off for having given its people the opportunity to make their voices heard. So instead of trying to make a persuasive case in one direction or the other on the question of Syrian decentralization, we're going to focus the final section of our episode today on a different question. What are the obstacles that Syria would have to overcome to make a decentralized government work? Now, before anything else, Syria and its people would have to decide how to carve the country up. They'd have to figure out where to place territorial borders, either by simply saying that each individual province is administered by its local majority, or otherwise partitioning chunks of land to be led by each individual group. The Syrian government would need to figure out what to do with the Sunni Arab majority, whether to leave them as a separate, federally administered group under the control of Damascus, in places where they're the majority, or to have them split off into their own autonomous regions, either a single, massive Sunni Arab jurisdiction or a series of smaller ones. With that, Syria would have to find some way to handle the relocation problem, what to do with the people who've become a new minority in each area, whether they're Sunnis living under Alawites, Assyrians living under Kurds, Bedouins living under Druze, or whoever else. Not only that, but they have to figure out a way to protect members of the Druze or Alawite or Christian or other targeted minorities who now live in areas where the local majority has been empowered to self-administer and where that same local majority may believe that they can get away with acts of violence. Modern history has shown time and time again that it's not enough to just draw new lines onto old maps and expect people to live under their new jurisdictions. As ethnic and religious groups migrate from their homes to the areas where they'll be the majority or try to consolidate control over those majority areas, there would be major potential for violence in a nation with innumerable old wounds from the civil war and an unnerving number of weapons in circulation. Once autonomous enclaves are established, the next question will be how to keep them viable, both from an economic and a security perspective. Some areas, like oil-rich Riyadh, would be just fine in an economic sense, while others, especially those living on small chunks of territory, would struggle to support themselves. As a result, it would fall to whatever's left of Syria's federal government to work out a way for each autonomous zone to be reasonably prosperous and contribute to what would have to be a very carefully managed national economy. Questions of wealth redistribution would become unavoidable, and those questions would probably be somewhat sensitive in a nation where every autonomous zone has its own well-armed paramilitary to defend its interests. Those paramilitaries would pose challenges of their own, and not just because they might occasionally turn their forces against other autonomous zones or against the federal Syrian government. Even in peacetime, how would Syria ensure that none of the paramilitaries grow too powerful while also ensuring that none of them are disproportionately weak or powerless compared to their better armed neighbors? And how do you ensure that non-state actors like the Islamic State organization don't simply pick off one of the weaker autonomous regions in a lightning assault before government forces can intervene? More broadly, what would the role of a Syrian federal government even be? We can say with reasonable certainty that it would exist in some form, instead of Syria just splintering into a dozen new nations that all declare their independence. And we can say that a Syrian federal government inside this system would probably take over matters of international affairs while maintaining a nationwide military force. But how would the day-to-day challenges of federal administration be handled in a nation that's made up of a loose confederacy of autonomous regions? In all likelihood, those autonomous regions would be interested in keeping the federal government relatively small and relatively underpowered. But it takes a massive bureaucracy to be able to coordinate a sprawling, disconnected economy or maintain transportation infrastructure or public utilities or any of the other services that individual enclaves couldn't manage by themselves. It takes a specially constructed sort of military to be able to rapidly intervene and either diffuse conflicts between the autonomous regions themselves or defend vulnerable regions from attack from an outside or non-state force. And any federal government in that position will have to make a difficult choice. Either encourage world nations to work with individual regions directly, giving up much of their federal control, or try to ensure that international diplomacy runs through the capital, creating a need for a more powerful federal government. We said at the outset of this episode, and we'll say it again here, the call for a decentralized Syria isn't coming from us, but from Syria's own minority communities. After everything that those communities have experienced under Syria's new leadership, they've decided that it's time for a real conversation on autonomous government. Perhaps they're right in arguing that Syria's center cannot hold, that the idea of a unified Syrian state is little more than a pipe dream at this moment in history. But even if there's real reason to believe in the value of a decentralized Syria, there's also real reason to believe that actually building this version of Syria would be an incredibly messy process filled with bureaucratic headaches, major obstacles to state stability, and innumerable pathways for Syria to descend yet again into brutal sectarian violence. It's important to ask whether a unified Syria is even the right approach to Syrian statehood. But if the answer is no, then it's just as important to ask whether Syria's leaders, its institutions, and its many disparate communities are up to the task of decentralization. Right now, Damascus is strongly opposed to the model for the future that Syria's minority leaders have put forth, and Damascus is either unable or unwilling to even keep its own minorities safe at a moment of escalating crisis. Perhaps there really is someone in Syria who could manage a transition to a decentralized national confederacy and build a government that could oversee a group of self-administering regions all living together in a peaceful coexistence. But if that person does exist, then they don't have a voice in Damascus today, and until that problem is somehow solved, even the best plans to reform the nation of Syria risk tearing it apart at the seams. Thank you for watching.